before.
Dry lines of cars are already forming outside gas stations in parts of the Midwest, but many drivers are finding the same answer: pumps running dry or limits on how much fuel they can buy. The spark came from Alberta, Canada's oil heartland, cutting exports to the United States in a sharp response to new tariffs out of Washington. Within days, supply chains that keep food and freight moving began to strain, and prices at the pump surged higher than most families have seen in years. Governors are pressing Washington for emergency action, but experts warn the clock is ticking. If supplies don't recover soon, the northern United States could face a full-scale breakdown in fuel and goods. So which states are taking the hardest hit? Let's explore. Washington has long stood at the center of the Pacific Northwest's energy trade. Its location along more than 780 kilometers of border with British Columbia and its access to ports like Seattle and Tacoma made it not only a gateway for fuel imports from Alberta, but also a crucial supplier for Oregon, Idaho, and even parts of Alaska. When Alberta retaliated against Washington's new tariffs by cutting oil exports to the United States, no state felt the blow faster. Fuel shipments through the Peace Arch and Sumas crossings collapsed by more than 60% almost overnight. Storage depots in Anacortes and Cherry Point dropped to record lows in days, and tankers docking in Seattle were forced to leave empty when Canadian supply failed to arrive. The effect on daily life was immediate. Gas stations in Seattle, Spokane, and Bellingham posted out of fuel signs or ration sales to only 8 to 10 gallons per car. Rural stations went further, closing down entirely after deliveries stopped coming. Long lines formed before dawn as residents tried to secure fuel while prices surged beyond $6 a gallon, the highest level in over 2 decades. The shortage spread beyond commuters. Fishermen in Puget Sound were unable to leave harbor as diesel supplies evaporated, raising the risk of losing an entire seafood season. Trucking companies canceled 1/3 of scheduled routes, a cut that disrupted deliveries into neighboring states. For apple and cherry farmers, the situation could not be worse, with harvest season approaching and no guarantee their crops would make it to market. If the squeeze lasts, analysts warn Washington could see fuel climb to $7 per gallon, container activity at Seattle and Tacoma ports sink further, and countless small businesses that rely on steady transportation forced to close their doors. Michigan, once proud of its role as the nation's automotive hub, quickly found itself transformed into an epicenter of the shortage. The state's dependence on Alberta's crude through the Line 5 and Enbridge mainline pipelines left it vulnerable to even the slightest disruption, and the retaliation from Canada hit with full force. Within 72 hours of the export cut, stations in Detroit, Flint, and Grand Rapids began running completely dry. Prices jumped from $3.95 to $4.65 in only 4 days, the sharpest spike since the energy turmoil of 2022. Many stations rationed fuel at 10 gallons per customer, hoping to stretch dwindling reserves. The shock to Michigan's economy was widespread. As a key transportation corridor for the Great Lakes, the shortage rippled through logistics networks. Freight companies pulled back long-haul routes to Ohio and Illinois. Frozen food distributors in Detroit raised alarms about supply chain breakdowns as fuel costs soared and delivery schedules slowed. Auto plants in Detroit, Dearborn, and Lansing prepared for material shortages as shipments failed to arrive on time, forcing some facilities to cut shifts rather than stack undeliverable inventory. In response, Governor Gretchen Whitmer declared an energy emergency, authorizing the release of state reserves and relaxing limits on tanker driver hours. Lansing called on Washington to negotiate directly with Ottawa to restore pipeline flows, while officials weighed suspending state fuel taxes to ease the burden on drivers. In New York, the situation grew dire along the St. Lawrence River. Communities in counties like St. Lawrence, Jefferson, and Franklin depended heavily on fuel brought across from Quebec and Ontario. When Alberta slashed exports, those towns became hotspots of scarcity within days. Many stations shut their doors outright or operated in short windows to conserve whatever supply remained. In some rural areas, residents drove 50 or 60 kilometers to find open pumps, inflating both travel costs and production expenses for farmers and businesses. The effect spread quickly into daily routines. Long lines stretched across Watertown and Plattsburgh before sunrise as families tried to fuel up before stations imposed 8 to 10 gallon limits. Emergency vehicles were given priority as local transit operators reduced bus routes and freight carriers cut schedules. Prices leapt more than 30% in a week, with averages crossing $5 a gallon, while border towns reported prices between $5.30 and $5.50, levels not seen in years. Minnesota, deep in the Midwest and tied to Alberta through Manitoba and Ontario, was hit with equal force. The state's reliance on Canadian crude meant shortages arrived within days. In Minneapolis, major chains such as BP, Holiday, and Speedway capped sales at 10 to 12 gallons per customer, trying to extend their stockpiles. In Duluth, the port city on Lake Superior, local authorities introduced a rotating refueling schedule, allowing neighborhoods to access fuel only at specific times of day. By 5 in the morning, cars already formed long queues as drivers tried to fill up before rations ran out. Prices responded with alarming speed, climbing more than 25% in a week. Statewide averages approached $5, while rural and suburban areas broke through $5.20. Families adjusted daily life, consolidating errands and even working remotely to cut back on travel. Trucking firms and delivery services reported operating costs rising by 30 to 40%. Farmers in Stearns and Nobles counties faced the most difficult task of all, struggling to cover the fuel needed for tractors and grain dryers. With harvest season pressing, many risk losing entire crops. Minnesota's governor urged residents to conserve fuel for essential purposes and open negotiations for alternate supplies from the Gulf Coast. Yet experts warned prices will remain high for weeks, and without Canadian flows, the state could face a prolonged crisis that reaches from farms to freight to daily household routines. North Dakota, known for its own oil fields in the Williston Basin, might appear resilient in an energy dispute, yet much of the state's crude output is shipped away, while its refined fuel consumption depends heavily on Alberta and Great Lakes refineries. Within 48 hours of the export cut, stations in Minot and Williston imposed rationing at 10 gallons per vehicle. Small-town stations closed by midday when deliveries never arrived. Average prices surged from $3.85 to $4.45 in 3 days. For North Dakota's farmers, the timing could not have been worse. With wheat, soybean, and canola harvests underway, machinery sat idle as diesel supplies dwindled. Trucking firms moving crude from drilling sites to refineries experienced costly delays, reverberating through the broader energy network. Freight operators running routes to Minnesota and Montana reported fuel bills swelling by more than a quarter. Along the Canadian border, long waits at the pump grew routine, while in isolated areas a black market appeared, charging 30% above official rates. The state government responded by loosening transport rules, allowing fuel tankers to run without standard driving hour restrictions. Governor Doug Burgum urged Washington to tap federal reserves for immediate relief in border states. Montana is a land of vast distances, where fuel is not a convenience but a lifeline. Communities are separated by hundreds of miles of highway, and the state's farms, ranches, and freight routes depend on steady shipments from across the border. When Alberta cut oil exports to the United States, Montana's fragile network buckled almost immediately. Cities like Billings, Great Falls, and Helena saw cars snaking down blocks before sunrise as drivers waited hours to secure only 8 or 10 gallons at a time. In western towns such as Kalispell and Missoula, pumps ran completely dry and stations locked their doors. Truckers traveling long stretches between Washington, Idaho, and North Dakota had nowhere to refuel, and refrigerated goods began piling up in warehouses with no way to reach their destinations. Cold storage operators warned of mounting losses, as meat, produce, and dairy spoiled in place, while small transport companies shut down operations entirely rather than sink further into debt as fuel costs surged. Farmers who needed diesel for tractors, irrigation systems, and delivery trucks were forced to scale back work in the middle of the growing season. Within days, grocery prices began climbing as freight costs soared across the state. For remote rural towns with only a handful of fueling stations, the impact was even harsher. Entire communities found themselves cut off from regular supplies, leaving residents to travel hours in search of gasoline. State officials moved quickly to prioritize essential services, directing limited reserves toward ambulances, hospitals, and firefighting units. In Vermont, the crisis hit with equal force. Despite its smaller size and population. Nestled along the Canadian border, the state depends on both Quebec and New York for nearly all of its fuel, from diesel for dairy farms to heating oil that keeps homes warm through the long winters. Within a week of Alberta's export cuts, imports fell by more than 40%. Storage facilities in Burlington and Montpelier warned they had barely 10 days of supply remaining. Across the state, stations imposed strict purchase caps and lines stretched through neighborhoods as prices spiked to nearly $6 a gallon, the highest in Vermont's history. Heating oil, a critical resource for residents, leapt upward by more than 30% almost overnight, sparking fears of unbearable costs in the months ahead. The agricultural sector, central to Vermont's identity and economy, was among the first to stumble. Dairy farms in Addison and Franklin counties struggled to keep trucks fueled for daily milk collection. Processing plants in Middlebury cut shifts as shipments fell through, while some maple syrup producers suspended production entirely, unable to cover soaring energy expenses. What started as a tariff fight has spiraled into a national emergency. Governors are pleading for relief, emergency reserves are being drained, and desperate bids for foreign fuel are underway. But none of these quick fixes can replace the steady flow once guaranteed by Canadian oil. If the standoff drags on, prices could explode past historic highs, supply chains could stall, and the economy could be thrown into a storm with no clear way out. Experts say the countdown has already begun and time is running short. So how far can this crisis spread? And what would it mean if fuel shortages became the new normal? Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more.